My family texted that they needed distance from me and asked me to stop contacting them completely. My uncle was the one who encouraged them to do it. I simply replied that of course I would cancel my direct deposits first thing in the morning. I had no idea that my simple text would trigger a financial collapse that would strip them of everything they owned. Before I share my story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to cut off toxic family members who mistook your silence for weakness. I am Zora, 35 years old, and until a cool Tuesday evening in late October, I was the designated disappointment of my family. I was sitting in my downtown Atlanta condo reviewing a commercial real estate contract when my personal cell phone buzzed on the kitchen island, the screen illuminated with a notification from the family group chat. I picked up the device and read a long, meticulously crafted paragraph from my mother, Vivian. The words were a calculated strike. She stated clearly that she and my father, Desmond, were ascending to the highest tiers of Atlanta society. They were finalizing their memberships at an exclusive country club and networking with the elite executive board of the local Jack and Jill chapter. Vivian wrote that my presence in their lives had become a liability. She called me socially unfit. She explicitly typed that my community college background and my supposedly uncultured aesthetic did not align with their new brand. She said it was time for us to part ways so they could focus on the people who truly represented their values. Jasmine. My 32-year-old sister immediately chimed in to validate our mother. Jasmine was the golden child, the perfect Spelman graduate, and a self-proclaimed luxury realtor. She sent a text saying I had been holding on to toxic jealousy ever since our parents happily paid her out-of-state tuition while I was left serving tables to survive. She told me to stop dragging them down with my poverty mindset. Before I could even process the sheer audacity of her message, Uncle Roland added his voice to the chorus. Roland was my father's brother, a man who survived entirely on grift and loud opinions. He typed that my attitude was toxic, that I lacked the elegance required for Black excellence, and that it was best I stay away from their upcoming family events. He demanded I respect their boundaries and stop contacting them completely. They expected a reaction. They expected me to cry, to beg for their approval, or to launch into a desperate defense of my character. They wanted the satisfaction of watching the family scapegoat grovel for a seat at their perfectly set table. Instead, I felt absolutely nothing. Years of emotional distance had calcified my heart against their cruelty. I did not shed a single tear. I did not write a long paragraph defending my childhood struggles or pointing out their blatant hypocrisy. I simply tapped the reply box and typed my response. I wrote that I completely understood their need for distance. I told them I would respect their boundaries and cancel the direct deposits first thing in the morning. I hit send, tossed the phone onto the sofa, and walked straight to my home office. The truth was, I was not a struggling community college dropout. I had left that school 15 years ago, not because I was failing, but because I had launched a software startup that demanded my full attention. Over the past decade and a half, I had built Vanguard Acquisitions from a tiny tech venture into a billion-dollar commercial real estate and financial technology holding firm. I was the silent founder, the majority shareholder, and the sole decision-maker. I owned the buildings they shopped in. I owned the hospitality groups they desperately tried to get reservations with. I had amassed a level of wealth they could not even comprehend. But they never knew. When my grandfather passed away 5 years ago, I used my resources to set up a blinded trust in his name. I funneled my own capital into it and had my lawyers present it to my parents as a hidden legacy dividend from his estate. I gave them $15,000 a month, tax-free, directly deposited into their checking account. I did it because it kept them comfortable, and more importantly, it kept them out of my hair. They took the money, used it to lease luxury cars, buy designer clothes, and fund their country club aspirations, all while looking down their noses at me. They believed their wealth was a birthright, and my perceived struggle was a moral failing. I sat at my mahogany desk and opened my secure banking portal. The glow of the monitor illuminated my calm expression. I navigated to the trust management dashboard. The $15,000 recurring transfer was scheduled to go out in exactly 3 days. With a single click of my mouse, I terminated the instruction. A green banner flashed across the screen confirming the cancellation. The legacy dividend was officially dead. I did not stop there. I pulled up the corporate accounts linked to my holding firm. Jasmine loved to parade around Atlanta, claiming she was a top-tier luxury realtor, but her entire business was a carefully constructed facade. She drove a leased G-Wagon, wore Chanel suits to open houses, and treated her assistants like garbage. What she did not know was that the corporate black card she used to fund her staging companies, her marketing campaigns, and her ridiculous wardrobe was actually tied to a subsidiary shell company owned by Vanguard Acquisitions. I had approved the line of credit through a proxy to ensure she could support herself without asking me for handouts. I watched her flex on social media every day, acting like a self-made boss, while I quietly paid for the gas in her car. I located the specific credit line attached to her name. I clicked the suspension button and permanently deactivated the card. I closed the laptop, poured myself a glass of sparkling water, and went to sleep with a clear conscience. I slept better that night than I had in years. Less than 12 hours later, the consequences of my late-night clerical work exploded into reality. It was Wednesday morning, and I was reviewing quarterly projections with my Chief Operating Officer, Malik. My personal phone began to ring incessantly on the conference table. The caller ID flashed Vivian's name. She called 5 times in rapid succession before I finally answered. I did not even get a chance to say hello. The sound of pure, unadulterated panic erupted through the speaker. Vivian was shrieking, her voice echoing with the ambient noise of a busy retail store. She was standing at the checkout counter of Neiman Marcus in Buckhead. She had invited the entire executive board of the local Jack and Jill chapter for a morning of personal shopping and champagne to celebrate her upcoming country club induction. She had marched to the register with thousands of dollars worth of designer merchandise, ready to swipe her card and secure her status as the ultimate Atlanta matriarch. The cashier had run the card 3 times. It declined every single time. She was humiliating herself in front of the exact women she had just deemed me too unfit to associate with. Vivian screamed into the phone that there was a massive bank error. She demanded I use my limited community college connections to call a bank teller and fix the problem immediately. She threatened that if I did not sort out the trust fund deposit right that second, she would officially ban me from attending Jasmine's upcoming vow renewal ceremony. She said I was ruining her life and making her look like a fool in front of her high society friends. The cashier could be heard in the background politely asking for an alternate form of payment. The wealthy women behind her were whispering. I listened to her frantic threats with total serenity. I did not raise my voice. I spoke slowly and clearly so she could hear every syllable over the store's background music. I told her there was no bank error. I reminded her of the text message she had sent the night before. I told her she had explicitly requested complete distance and stated that my presence was a liability to her new brand. I informed her I was simply honoring her boundaries as a good daughter should. I said I hoped the Jack and Jill board enjoyed the show. And then I pressed the end call button right in the middle of her outraged gasp. I set the phone face down on the table. Malik looked at me from across the room, raising one eyebrow in silent question. I waved my hand, signaling that we should return to the quarterly projections. But before Malik could pull up the next slide, my phone buzzed violently against the wood grain of the table. A notification popped onto the screen. It was not Vivian this time. It was a new audio message. The sender was Connor, Jasmine's white husband, a man who fashioned himself as an elite wealth manager and the smartest person in any room he walked into. I tapped the screen to play the voice note. His tone was aggressive, dripping with condescension and unearned authority, demanding that I answer the phone and prepare to face serious legal consequences for my actions. The war had officially begun. The shrill ringing of my personal cell phone shattered the quiet focus of the conference room. I had just set the device face down, After disconnecting the call with my mother Vivian, leaving her to deal with her public humiliation at the luxury department store. Malik, my chief operating officer, was standing by the digital presentation board, his hands clasped behind his back, waiting for my signal to resume our quarterly review. But the phone simply would not stop vibrating against the polished mahogany table. The caller identification flashed brightly. It was my younger sister, Jasmine. I let it ring 3 times, savoring the absolute desperation echoing through the digital chime, before I finally swiped the screen and brought the phone to my ear. I did not even get the chance to say a single word. Jasmine was completely hysterical. Her voice tore through the speaker so loud and piercing that I had to pull the phone a few inches away from my face. She demanded to know what kind of sick game I was playing with her life. She screamed that she was sitting in the middle of a high-end furniture showroom, trying to finalize the staging details for a multi-million-dollar property listing, and her corporate card had just been declined in front of 3 different vendors. She accused me of somehow hacking into the bank system to sabotage her career. She said I was a miserable, vindictive woman who could not stand to see her younger sister thriving in the competitive world of Atlanta real estate. Her accusations were rapid, breathless, and entirely detached from reality. She did not pause for an explanation. She went straight for the jugular, weaponizing the past just as our parents had taught her. She screamed that I had been intensely jealous of her ever since our mother and father proudly paid for her full tuition at Spelman College, while I was left serving greasy plates at a downtown diner just to keep a roof over my head. She said I was a bitter dropout who spent my entire life resenting her black excellence. She commanded me to stop messing with her banking error immediately, or she would have me arrested for cybercrime. I sat perfectly still, listening to the frantic breathing of a woman whose entire identity was built on a foundation of lies. I thought about those days waiting tables, coming home with aching feet and smelling like fried food, while Jasmine posted pictures of her luxury dorm room and her designer graduation gifts. I thought about how she paraded around the city, calling herself a self-made luxury realtor, buying social media followers and paying for public relations articles to feature her as a top-tier boss. She truly believed her own hype. She genuinely thought she was a financial prodigy. I waited until she completely ran out of breath. When the line fell silent save for her heavy panting, I spoke. My voice was calm, completely devoid of the emotional chaos she desperately wanted to provoke. I told her there was no banking error. I told her no one had hacked into her accounts. I clearly and coldly informed her that the corporate black card she had been swiping to fund her staging companies, her designer wardrobe, and her perfectly curated aesthetic was permanently deactivated because it belonged to me. The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. I could almost hear the gears grinding in her head as she tried to process my words. I did not give her the space to formulate a denial. I explained the reality of her situation. I told her that the prestigious subsidiary firm she thought was backing her real estate ventures was entirely owned by Vanguard Acquisitions. I told her that for the last 3 years, I had been the silent proxy approving her ridiculous lines of credit so she could pretend to be a successful businesswoman. I told her that every tank of gas in her leased luxury vehicle, every piece of staged furniture, and every overpriced brunch she posted online had been paid for by the same sister she just called a miserable dropout. Jasmine let out a shaky, high-pitched laugh. She said I was completely insane. She accused me of having a psychotic break, claiming I was making up elaborate delusions to cope with my own pathetic life. She told me I was sick and needed institutional help. But underneath her mocking tone, the panic was unmistakable. She knew her card was dead. She knew she was standing in a showroom with vendors demanding payment she did not have. Her denial quickly morphed back into aggressive threats. She told me I was going to pay for this stunt. She promised that she was calling her husband right that second. She swore that Connor was going to legally crush me, that his financial firm would tear my life apart, and that I would end up in jail for financial interference. She slammed the phone down, disconnecting the call with a sharp click. I lowered the phone and looked up at Malik. He had watched the entire exchange with a calm, analytical gaze. Before I could even ask him to pull up the next set of corporate documents, my phone buzzed again. This time, the screen displayed an incoming call from Connor. Connor was a white man who had swooped into my family, playing the role of the ultimate savior. He presented himself as an elite wealth manager, a financial genius who handled portfolios for the city's most exclusive clients. My parents absolutely worshipped him. They paraded him around their country club circles as proof that their family had arrived at the pinnacle of success. He was always immaculately dressed, endlessly arrogant, and completely dismissive of my existence. I answered the call. Connor did not bother with a greeting. He immediately launched into a tirade filled with aggressive legal jargon and condescending buzzwords. He spoke to me as if I were a child who had accidentally stumbled into a bank vault. He told me that my little prank with Jasmine's credit card was cute, but the adults were taking over now. He explicitly threatened to sue me for tortious interference with a business entity. He threw around words like embezzlement, fiduciary duty, and criminal liability. He warned me that if the direct deposit to my parents and the credit line to his wife were not reinstated within 1 hour, he would bring the full weight of his wealth management firm down on my head. I did not interrupt him. I sat back in my leather chair, grabbed a pen, and pulled a notepad toward me. I let him talk, allowing his ego to inflate with every ridiculous threat he made. When he finally paused to take a breath, assuming he had thoroughly intimidated the uneducated sister-in-law, I spoke. I asked him a very simple question. I asked him to state exactly which wealth management firm he claimed to represent and exactly which legal statutes he believed I was violating. Connor scoffed, clearly annoyed that I was not crying or apologizing. He confidently named his boutique financial group, puffing out his chest through the phone. He declared that he possessed full legal authorization over the family trust and that he was going to order a comprehensive forensic audit of the entire legacy dividend structure by the end of the day. He promised he would expose my interference and leave me completely destitute. I smiled. The corners of my mouth lifted in genuine amusement. I told him that was a fantastic idea. I encouraged him to audit the trust immediately. I told him I looked forward to seeing his findings. Then, without another word, I hung up the phone. I tossed the device onto the table and turned my attention fully to my chief operating officer. I told Malik to initiate a complete corporate background check on Connor and his boutique financial firm. I wanted every tax filing, every investment portfolio, every real estate holding, and every margin call pulled and verified immediately. I wanted Connor's entire financial existence dissected and laid bare on my desk. Malik did not ask questions. He simply nodded, opened his encrypted laptop, and went to work. The efficiency of Vanguard acquisitions was a terrifying weapon when unleashed. Within 30 minutes, Malik was projecting a series of highly sensitive financial documents onto the digital board in the conference room. The facade of the perfect wealthy brother-in-law began to disintegrate right before my eyes. Malik walked me through the wreckage of Connor's career. Connor was not an elite wealth manager. He was a desperate gambler drowning in catastrophic losses. Over the past 18 months, he had poured massive amounts of capital into highly volatile cryptocurrency markets, ignoring basic risk management protocols. When the market crashed, his portfolios were decimated. He was facing massive margin calls and desperate clients demanding their money. Malik revealed that Connor's boutique firm was essentially insolvent, surviving on a delicate web of shifted funds and delayed payments. But the most damning revelation was how Connor had attempted to cover his tracks. Malik pulled up a property deed and a corresponding loan agreement. It was the deed to my parents' sprawling Atlanta mansion. Connor had taken out a massive high-interest secondary mortgage against the property to secure a lifeline of cash for his failing firm. He had leveraged the very house my parents used as their ultimate status symbol. But Connor had made a fatal miscalculation. He assumed the mansion was fully owned by Desmond and Vivian. He did not know that when my parents originally faced foreclosure 3 years ago, I had quietly purchased the debt through one of my holding companies to keep them from being thrown out on the street. Vanguard Acquisitions held the primary mortgage, and looking closely at the secondary loan documents, the signature belonging to my father Desmond was an obvious, desperate forgery. Connor had committed federal mortgage fraud against my holding company to cover his crypto losses. As Malik highlighted the forged signatures on the screen, my phone vibrated with an incoming text message. It was from Connor. He had sent a photograph of a highly official-looking document. It was a cease and desist letter, demanding the immediate reinstatement of the family trust funds, filled with aggressive legal threats, and printed on his firm's premium letterhead. It was a cheap intimidation tactic designed to scare a woman he thought had no resources. I looked at the forged legal threat on my screen, and then I looked at the undeniable proof of federal fraud on the presentation board. I forwarded Connor's text message directly to my corporate legal team with a single instruction to prepare a comprehensive fraud dossier for the authorities. Then I asked Malik to pull up the commercial leasing agreements for our downtown properties. Connor's boutique wealth management firm was located in a highly sought-after ultra-luxury high-rise in the financial district. He boasted about that office constantly. It was the crown jewel of his fake empire. Malik pulled up the lease agreement. The building was owned and operated by Vanguard Acquisitions. Connor was completely unaware that he was renting his prestigious office space directly from me. Furthermore, he was 2 months behind on his rent. I instructed Malik to print the commercial eviction notice. I took my favorite fountain pen, smoothed the paper flat on the mahogany table, and signed my name with absolute precision. The notice was effective immediately. Connor was not just losing his family funding, he was losing the very walls that housed his fraudulent empire. The trap was fully set and my family was sprinting directly into it. The digital projector hummed quietly as Malik mirrored his encrypted laptop to the main conference room display. The initial summary of Apex Capital Partners flashed across the screen, and the sheer magnitude of the financial disaster was staggering. Connor had spent the last 3 years curating an image of untouchable wealth, lecturing me at every Thanksgiving dinner about asset diversification and the importance of aggressive market strategies. He wore bespoke Italian suits and drove a $100,000 sports car, presenting himself to my parents as the ultimate financial savior. The reality illuminating the wall in front of me was a completely different story. Connor was not an elite wealth manager. He was a desperate drowning man running a glorified Ponzi scheme. Malik walked me through the wreckage step by step. Over the past 18 months, Connor had bypassed every standard risk management protocol and funneled massive amounts of his clients' capital into highly volatile, unregulated cryptocurrency markets. He was chasing impossible returns to cover up previous bad investments. When the crypto market inevitably crashed, his portfolios were absolutely decimated. The screens displayed columns of red numbers, margin calls that had gone unanswered, and frantic internal emails from angry investors demanding their quarterly disbursements. Apex Capital Partners was essentially insolvent. Connor was surviving on a delicate web of shifted funds, using incoming client money to pay off the most aggressive complaints. He was days, maybe hours away from a total catastrophic collapse. I sat back in my chair, absorbing the sheer scale of his incompetence. My sister Jasmine paraded this man around as a trophy, using his supposed elite status to justify her own arrogance. My parents treated his word as gospel, willingly cutting off their own flesh and blood to protect the delicate sensibilities of his high society circle. They had traded me for a man who was actively speeding toward a federal indictment. But the financial mismanagement was not the worst of it. Malik tapped his keyboard, bringing up a separate folder labeled Secured Collateral. Connor had needed a massive immediate injection of liquidity to stave off the Securities and Exchange Commission and his most volatile investors. Traditional banks had already shut him out. He needed a hard asset to leverage, and he found one sitting right in his own family tree. The document that filled the screen was a commercial loan agreement for $4 million. The collateral listed was my parents' sprawling mansion in the affluent Buckhead neighborhood of Atlanta. It was the house they used as their ultimate status symbol, the property they leveraged to secure their upcoming country club memberships. Connor had taken out a massive high-interest secondary mortgage against the estate. He had literally gambled away the roof over my parents' heads. I stared at the digitized signature on the final page of the loan agreement. It was supposed to be my father's signature authorizing the lien against the property. I leaned closer to the screen. Desmond's handwriting was famously sharp and angular, a byproduct of decades spent drafting architectural blueprints. The signature on the screen was round, hesitant, and entirely incorrect. Connor had not just leveraged the house. He had forged his father-in-law's signature to do it. But Connor had made one fatal, spectacular miscalculation. He assumed the Buckhead mansion was fully owned by Desmond and Vivian. He assumed they held the primary deed free and clear. He did not know that 3 years ago, when my parents originally faced a quiet, embarrassing foreclosure due to their relentless overspending, I had intervened. I never told them. I simply had one of Vanguard Acquisition's subsidiary holding companies quietly purchase the debt from their original lender, restructuring it to keep them from being thrown out onto the street. Vanguard Acquisitions held the primary mortgage. Connor had committed federal wire and mortgage fraud, and the institution he had defrauded was entirely owned by the sister-in-law he had just threatened to destroy. As Malik highlighted the undeniable proof of federal crimes, my personal phone vibrated against the mahogany table. It was a new message from Connor. I unlocked the screen to find an image attachment. It was a photograph of a highly official-looking document printed on heavy cardstock with the Apex Capital Partners logo embossed at the top. It was a cease and desist letter. I read the text, my amusement growing with every poorly constructed sentence. The document was a masterclass in desperate intimidation. It demanded the immediate reinstatement of the family trust funds and the reactivation of Jasmine's corporate credit line. It was filled with aggressive misspelled legal Latin and cited commercial statutes that did not even exist. Connor threatened that if I did not comply within 24 hours, he would personally ensure a warrant was issued for my arrest regarding the embezzlement of family assets. It was a pathetic, amateurish forgery designed to bully the uneducated, struggling girl he firmly believed I was. He thought a fancy letterhead would send me running back to my place at the bottom of the family hierarchy. I did not type a response. I did not engage with his delusion. I simply forwarded the image of the forged cease and desist letter directly to my lead corporate counsel with a single clear directive. I instructed my legal team to add this new document to the rapidly growing federal fraud dossier we were compiling against Connor and his firm. I set the phone down and looked back up at Malik. The game of defense was officially over. I asked my chief operating officer to access the commercial leasing agreements for our downtown Atlanta portfolio. Connor loved bragging about his ultra-luxury office suite in the heart of the financial district. It was the crown jewel of his fake empire, the place where he invited wealthy clients to sip expensive scotch while he gambled their retirement funds away. He bragged about the floor-to-ceiling windows and the private elevator access at every family dinner. Malik typed rapidly, bringing up the master lease registry for the financial district high-rise. Connor was completely unaware that the towering glass building housing his prestigious firm was owned and operated by Vanguard Acquisitions. I scanned the leasing data. Not only was he a tenant in my building, but true to his current financial disaster, he was currently 90 days delinquent on his commercial rent. I instructed Malik to bypass the standard grace period protocols. I told him to print the commercial eviction notice immediately. The printer in the corner of the room hummed to life, sliding a crisp, formal document into the output tray. I stood up from my chair, walked over, and retrieved the paper. I carried it back to the table, took my gold fountain pen from my breast pocket, and smoothed the document flat. I signed my name with absolute, unwavering precision. The notice was effective immediately. Connor was not just losing his access to my money. I was ripping the physical walls off his fraudulent empire, and I was going to make sure he felt every single brick fall. The ink on Connor's eviction notice was barely dry when I left the Vanguard Acquisitions building and retreated to the absolute sanctuary of my downtown penthouse. I needed the silence of the 52nd floor to strategize my next move against a family that had spent decades treating me like an expendable asset. I had just poured myself a glass of sparkling water and stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Atlanta skyline when the harsh, unexpected buzzing of my front door intercom shattered the quiet. The private elevator access to my floor was strictly keycard controlled. Someone had bypassed the lobby concierge. I walked over to the security monitor mounted on the wall. The high-definition camera displayed a man whose mere presence used to make me shrink into the background of my parents' house. It was Uncle Roland. Roland was my father's older brother. He was a massive man who had spent his entire life using his physical size and booming voice to bully everyone around him into submission. He fancied himself the ultimate patriarch of the extended family, a man whose authority was absolute and unquestionable. Whenever there was a family dispute, Roland was brought in to deliver the final crushing verdict. He was the enforcer of the family hierarchy, the one who ensured everyone stayed in their assigned places. And my place, according to Roland, was at the very bottom. I pressed the intercom button and coldly asked how he had bypassed my building security. Roland did not answer the question. His voice blasted through the small speaker demanding that I open the door immediately. He shouted that we were going to have a serious conversation about respect and family obligations. I considered leaving him out there to shout at a piece of reinforced steel. But Vanguard Acquisitions operated on confronting problems head-on, not hiding from them. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the heavy door open, but I did not step back. I stood firmly, squarely in the center of the threshold, blocking any path inside. Roland loomed over me. His face was flushed red with anger and his fists were clenched at his sides. He expected me to step aside. He expected me to lower my eyes and invite him into my home like a scolded child facing the principal. When I did not move a single muscle, his expression twisted into a sneer of pure disgust. He told me I was a disgrace. He launched into an aggressive tirade demanding to know who I thought I was playing God with the family finances. He stated that my petty vindictive stunt with the trust fund had caused a massive medical emergency. He leaned in close, his voice dropping to a menacing growl, and informed me that my father Desmond was currently experiencing severe heart palpitations from the stress I had caused. He said Vivian was in hysterics, terrified that her husband was going to have a massive coronary event because of his ungrateful daughter's jealousy. I looked up at Roland, feeling absolutely nothing. 10 years ago, the mention of my father having a medical emergency would have sent me into a blind panic. I would have handed over everything I owned just to keep the peace. But I was no longer the frightened girl, desperate for their conditional love. I maintained eye contact with Roland and spoke with a calm, surgical precision. I told him that Desmond's heart palpitations were not my responsibility. I suggested that if my father was experiencing chest pains, Roland should be calling for a paramedic instead of driving across town to harass me at my private residence. Roland struck his heavy, open palm against the doorframe, a deliberate attempt to make me flinch. I did not blink. He shouted that I had no respect for my elders and no concept of family loyalty. He commanded me to pick up my phone, call my bank, and restore the direct deposits to Desmond and Vivian immediately. He said I owed them for putting a roof over my head and that I was going to fix this mess right now before he took matters into his own hands. I let out a dry, humorless laugh. I told Roland to stop pretending he cared about my father's cardiovascular health. I knew exactly why Roland was standing on my doorstep, sweating through his suit. I looked him up and down, taking in his expensive shoes and his custom watch. Roland had not held a legitimate job in a decade. He funded his lavish lifestyle and his expensive country club habits by constantly borrowing money from Desmond. Desmond, in turn, handed over that cash from the very trust fund I had been secretly financing. By cutting off my parents, I had effectively cut off Roland's primary source of income. I laid his entire financial reality bare right there in the hallway. I told him he was not a patriarch defending his sick brother. He was a parasite panicking because the host was finally dying. I told him he was terrified because without my money flowing through Desmond's bank accounts, he would have to sell his precious boat and actually find a job. The truth hit him like a physical blow. The illusion of the concerned elder shattered, leaving only a desperate, greedy man backed into a corner. His face shifted from angry red to a dangerous mottled purple. He took a heavy step forward, intentionally invading my personal space, trying to use his sheer bulk to force me backward into the foyer. He raised his hand, pointing a thick finger directly at my face, and snarled that he was going to teach me a lesson in respect that I would never forget. He shifted his weight, preparing to physically push past me and breach the threshold of my home to take by force what he could no longer demand. Before his heavy shoulder could even make contact with the doorframe, a sharp electronic chime echoed through the corridor. The polished steel doors of the private service elevator, located just 10 feet down the hall, slid open with a smooth mechanical hiss. I had silently triggered my pocket security fob the exact moment I saw his face on the intercom monitor. 3 men stepped out into the hallway. They were members of my building's elite private security detail, all former military contractors dressed in immaculate dark suits. They moved with absolute terrifying silence. Within seconds, they had crossed the distance and flanked Roland on both sides, their expressions hard and uncompromising, waiting for my single command. The 3 security contractors did not say a single word. They simply stepped into Roland's peripheral vision, their sheer size and impeccable posture instantly draining the manufactured bravado right out of his chest. The lead contractor, a man whose tailored suit barely concealed his formidable build, placed one hand firmly against the center of Roland's chest. It was not a violent shove, but it was an immovable barricade. Roland froze, his mouth hanging slightly open as the reality of his physical disadvantage washed over him. The hallway was completely silent, save for the heavy, panicked breathing of my uncle, realizing he had brought a butter knife to a ballistic missile fight. I stepped back into my foyer, leaving the front door wide open. I walked over to the sleek marble console table positioned beneath a modern, abstract painting. I reached into the leather briefcase I had brought home from the office and pulled out a thick, heavily tabbed manila folder. I turned around and tossed the file onto the cold marble surface. It landed with a heavy, satisfying thud that echoed out into the hallway. I did not invite Roland inside. I simply pointed at the folder and told him that his entire pathetic charade was over. Roland stared at the file, his eyes darting nervously between me and the security guards flanking him. I did not give him the courtesy of letting him guess what was inside. I laid it all out for him with surgical precision. I told him the folder contained 5 years of complete financial transcripts, bank routing numbers, and corporate tax filings. I watched the color drain completely from his face as I casually listed the shell companies he had registered under the guise of his so-called community outreach startup. Years ago, when my parents were still trying to figure out what to do with their rebellious, fiercely independent daughter, Roland had approached me. He had demanded I use the modest savings I was building from my early graphic design gigs to fund his visionary nonprofit initiative. I had taken one look at his glossy, substance-free business plan and laughed in his face. I knew exactly what it was. It was a grift. I refused to write him a check. I refused to blindly fund his lifestyle. And because I saw through him, Roland realized I was a massive threat to his easy access to the family wealth. I explained to him, standing there in my multi-million-dollar penthouse, that I knew exactly what he did next. The folder contained the proof. Roland had immediately gone to Desmond and Vivian and began whispering poison into their ears. He convinced them that my refusal to fund his community empowerment project was proof that I lacked family loyalty. He manipulated my parents into cutting me off financially and emotionally, telling them I was a selfish, ungrateful child who needed to learn a hard lesson in respect. He needed me out of the picture so that he could have unrestricted access to Desmond's wallet. He orchestrated my exile from the family purely to protect his own parasitic cash flow. Roland realized he was completely exposed. The facade of the wise, protective patriarch shattered into a million jagged pieces. Cornered and desperate, he resorted to the only weapon he had left. He went straight for the personal insults, his voice rising to a frantic, ugly shout. He leaned forward against the security guard's arm, his face contorting with rage. He screamed that I would always be the ghetto, uncultured disappointment of the family. He spat the words out, trying to inflict maximum damage. He yelled that I possessed no class, no pedigree, and absolutely no understanding of Black excellence. He declared that buying a fancy apartment and wearing expensive clothes would never change the fact that I was a bitter, isolated woman who lacked the grace and sophistication of my sister Jasmine. I stood perfectly still, letting his insults wash over me like water off glass. I did not raise my voice. I did not show him a single ounce of the pain he so desperately wanted to provoke. I simply looked at him with utter chilling disdain. I told him that true excellence did not involve stealing from his own brother to fund country club dinners. I told him that true excellence did not involve hiding behind a fake nonprofit to siphon money from a trust fund that he had absolutely zero part in creating. I clearly and coldly informed him that the money he had been draining from Desmond was not family legacy money. It was Vanguard Acquisitions money. It was my money. And as of this exact second, the bank had frozen every single account associated with his fraudulent outreach program. Roland opened his mouth to scream another insult, but the fight was instantly shut down. I gave a sharp, subtle nod to the lead security contractor. The guards moved with terrifying synchronization. Two of them gripped Roland by the arms, effortlessly lifting him onto his toes and spinning him around toward the waiting elevator. Roland thrashed and shouted, demanding they take their hands off him, threatening to sue my building and call the police. The contractors ignored his tantrums entirely, treating him like an unruly toddler being removed from a sophisticated adult environment. They marched him directly into the service elevator. The lead guard stepped back, locking eyes with me, and giving a brief, respectful nod of confirmation before pressing the lobby button. I watched Roland's red, furious face screaming silent curses at me as the heavy steel doors slid shut, cutting off his pathetic display forever. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, taking a deep breath of the quiet, sterile air. The emotional exhaustion was threatening to set in a heavy weight, pressing down on my shoulders after finally severing the toxic cord that had bound me to my uncle's manipulation for years. I turned to walk back inside and pour myself a stiff drink. Before I could even take 3 steps into the foyer, my personal cell phone erupted from my briefcase. It was a sharp, distinct alarm tone. It was the priority override ringtone I had specifically assigned to Malik. It was a sound reserved only for catastrophic corporate emergencies or absolute critical intelligence. I abandoned the idea of a drink, crossed the marble floor in 3 long strides, and snatched the phone from the leather bag. I swiped the screen and brought the device to my ear, skipping any form of greeting. I demanded to know what was wrong. Malik did not sound like his usual calm, analytical self. His voice was tight-clipped and moving at a rapid pace that sent an immediate spike of adrenaline straight through my chest. He told me to sit down and look at the secure terminal I had set up in my home office. He stated that the initial background check on Connor was a massive understatement. The crypto failures and the forged mortgage documents were just a smokescreen. Malik informed me that he had dug past the offshore holding accounts and breached the secondary encrypted servers Connor was utilizing. The rabbit hole went so much deeper than bad investments and desperate embezzlement. My brother-in-law was hiding something much worse, and it was about to detonate right in the middle of Vanguard Acquisitions. I held the encrypted phone tight against my ear and moved swiftly toward the glowing monitors of my home office terminal. The adrenaline from the hallway confrontation with Roland was still thrumming through my veins, but Malik's urgent tone instantly shifted my focus. He did not waste time with introductory briefings. He initiated a secure, high-level screen share, and my primary display flared to life, illuminating the darkened room with cascading rows of offshore banking data. Malik instructed me to look at the routing numbers associated with the family legacy dividend. I leaned over the mahogany desk, my eyes tracking the digitized flow of capital. This was the trust fund I had been quietly financing through a Vanguard Acquisitions subsidiary, the money I had authorized to keep my parents from drowning in their own financial incompetence. I watched the monthly disbursements leave my corporate accounts and travel toward Desmond and Vivian's primary bank. But the numbers did not align. The ledger was fractured. Malik had deployed our cyber forensics team to trace the discrepancies. The findings were breathtaking in their audacity. Only 60% of the capital I authorized was actually reaching my parents. The remaining 40% was being systematically siphoned off the top, diverted into a complex web of Cayman Island shell corporations before the funds ever hit Atlanta soil. I demanded to know exactly who controlled those offshore accounts. Malik bypassed the obfuscated ownership structures with a few keystrokes, pulling up the hidden corporate registry. The shell companies belonged to a joint entity completely controlled by 2 men. Connor and Roland. My jaw tightened as the sheer scale of the betrayal crystallized on the screen. The parasitic uncle and the fraudulent son-in-law had formed a quiet, incredibly lucrative alliance. For 3 long years, they had been executing a flawless skimming operation right under everyone's noses. Roland provided the necessary family cover. He used his position as the elder patriarch to constantly manipulate my parents into believing they needed more money, pressuring them to request larger dividend payouts to maintain their country club status. Connor, playing the role of the elite wealth manager, handled the back channels routing the inflated funds through his firm and quietly laundering the stolen capital into their private offshore accounts. They were actively, aggressively robbing Desmond and Vivian blind. And because I was the invisible benefactor silently funding the trust they had actually been stealing directly from Vanguard Acquisitions. The irony was almost suffocating. Roland had just stood in my hallway, his face purple with rage, screaming about family loyalty, respect, and duty. He had attempted to physically intimidate me into turning the money back on acting like a righteous defender of my father's health, all while he was the one actively embezzling from his own brother. Connor had threatened me with a forensic audit and federal charges, completely oblivious to the fact that an actual audit would expose his own systematic theft and guarantee his imprisonment. They thought they were the untouchable masterminds of Atlanta. Instead, they had been bleeding a corporate giant that could wipe them off the financial map with a single highly coordinated strike. I asked Malik what their exit strategy was. Criminals drowning in this level of toxic debt always had a desperate contingency plan when the walls inevitably started closing in. Malik's cursor danced across the monitor, closing the offshore ledgers and pulling up a completely different set of documents. These were not financial spreadsheets or encrypted bank transfers. They were vendor contracts, elite catering agreements, and invoices for imported floral arrangements. I stared at the screen, momentarily confused by the shift in data. Malik explained that Jasmine and Connor were throwing a massive $1 million vow renewal this upcoming weekend. They had rented out the most exclusive, highly secured botanical estate in the city. I felt a surge of pure disgust. My sister had been screaming at me just hours ago about her declined corporate card, absolutely terrified of losing her staging business and her public image while simultaneously preparing to host a 7-figure vanity project. But Malik quickly corrected my assumption. He clarified that the vow renewal had absolutely nothing to do with romance, marital bliss, or celebrating their relationship. Jasmine might have believed it was a showcase of her perfectly curated life, but for Connor, it was a highly orchestrated, incredibly desperate networking front. Connor was completely out of time. His catastrophic cryptocurrency losses had triggered internal alerts, and his elite investors were weeks, maybe days away from realizing their retirement portfolios were nothing but empty shells. The threat of Securities and Exchange Commission investigations and federal prison time was breathing down his neck. He needed a massive multi-million-dollar capital injection to quietly cover his tracks, refund the stolen trust money, and keep himself out of a federal penitentiary. The vow renewal was designed to be the ultimate illusion of success, wealth, and absolute stability. Connor was using his wife's manufactured glamour and my parents' perceived high society status to bait a financial savior. He had sent exclusive VIP invitations to the wealthiest, most aggressive private equity investors in the Southeast, hoping to dazzle them with expensive champagne and secure a lifeline before the market opened on Monday morning. I leaned forward, the glow of the monitors reflecting in my eyes, a cold anticipation settling in my chest. A man drowning in that much debt would not cast a wide random net. He would focus all of his remaining resources and energy on landing one massive whale. I asked Malik which specific private equity firm Connor was targeting. Malik brought up a series of intercepted emails, calendar requests, and heavily redacted investment pitches. Connor had been relentlessly courting a top-tier acquisition firm for the last 6 months. He had sent them dozens of blind pitches, practically begging for an audience with their executive board, promising unprecedented guaranteed returns if they bailed out his failing boutique management group. Malik highlighted the corporate logo on the targeted firm's executive summary. I let out a low, genuine laugh that echoed off the glass walls of my penthouse. The sound was devoid of humor, filled only with the sharp, thrilling realization of absolute victory. The primary investor Connor had invited to the vow renewal, the financial titan he was praying would swoop in, sip expensive wine, and save his fraudulent existence from total ruin, was Vanguard Acquisitions. Connor had sent a formal, desperate invitation to the chief executive officer of Vanguard, begging the faceless billionaire to attend his party and hand him a multi-million-dollar bailout. He had absolutely no idea that the elusive billionaire he was desperately courting was the exact same uncultured dropout sister-in-law he had just threatened to throw in jail. The trap had not just been set. My enemies had built it themselves, locked the door, and handed me the detonator. The tires of my black town car hissed against the wet cobblestones of the Elysian Plaza driveway. The hotel was the crown jewel of Midtown Atlanta luxury, and Connor had spared absolutely no expense for his grand illusion. Valets scrambled to open doors for arriving guests, ushering them into a lobby dripping in crystal chandeliers and imported orchids. I stepped out of the vehicle and smoothed the fabric of my tailored emerald gown. It was not a dress meant for a celebration. It was armor. I walked through the gilded revolving doors and stepped into the sprawling marble foyer leading to the grand ballroom. The entire space had been rented out for the evening. Connor was burning through the last fumes of his stolen capital to create an atmosphere of untouchable wealth. Waiters circled the perimeter carrying silver trays of vintage champagne and caviar. A string quartet played softly in the corner, providing a sophisticated soundtrack to an event built entirely on fraud. I did not immediately approach the ballroom doors. I stood near a towering floral arrangement and observed my family in their natural habitat. They were putting on the performance of a lifetime. My sister Jasmine was positioned near the grand staircase holding court in a custom white gown that was more extravagant than her actual wedding dress. She was draped in diamonds that were paid for by the offshore accounts Connor and Roland had established with my money. She threw her head back in a loud musical laugh, touching the arm of an older man I recognized as a mid-level partner at a local investment firm. She was playing the role of the devoted high society wife with sickening perfection. My parents, Desmond and Vivian, stood a few feet away, completely intoxicated by the manufactured glamour. My mother was holding a glass of champagne, looking down her nose at the serving staff, while simultaneously boasting to a group of socialites about her son-in-law's brilliant financial acumen. Uncle Roland was stationed near the open bar, a massive cigar clamped between his teeth, puffing his chest out as he loudly recounted fabricated stories of his community outreach successes. But it was Connor who commanded my full attention. He stood near the velvet ropes guarding the ballroom entrance. He was wearing a bespoke tuxedo, but he looked physically ill. A thin layer of sweat coated his forehead, and his eyes darted frantically toward the main lobby entrance every few seconds. He was not greeting his friends or celebrating his marriage. He was desperately waiting for the Vanguard Acquisitions executive team to arrive. He was waiting for his savior. He was waiting for me. I stepped out from behind the floral display and walked directly toward the velvet ropes. The entrance was flanked by two massive private security guards holding digital guest list tablets. As I approached, Connor caught sight of me. His desperate, searching expression instantly morphed into a mask of pure aristocratic outrage. He whispered something to Jasmine, who snapped her head in my direction. Her fake high society smile vanished, replaced by a sneer of absolute disgust. They broke away from their wealthy guests and marched toward the velvet rope to intercept me before I could even reach the security guards. Jasmine arrived first, crossing her arms over her sequined bodice. She looked me up and down with open contempt and loudly demanded to know what on earth I was doing there. She told me this was a $1 million private event for the Atlanta elite, not a public charity shelter for estranged bitter relatives. Connor stepped up beside her, adjusting his silk bow tie with trembling fingers. He lowered his voice to a harsh, menacing hiss and ordered me to turn around and walk out the front doors immediately. He stated that tonight was the most important financial networking event of his career, and he was not going to let my pathetic, uncultured presence ruin his chances with the private equity investors arriving at any moment. He told the two large security guards to keep a close eye on me and to physically remove me from the premises if I attempted to take another step toward the ballroom. The lead security guard, a thick-necked man with a patronizing smirk, stepped forward and held up a massive hand. He asked for my name in a tone usually reserved for dealing with trespassers. I gave him my name clearly and calmly. He tapped his screen a few times, let out a harsh breath of amusement, and proudly announced that I was not on the approved guest list. He crossed his arms and told me I needed to vacate the private event area, or he would be forced to call the hotel management and have me escorted off the property by law enforcement. Jasmine let out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed in the cavernous foyer. She leaned forward, her voice dripping with venom, and told me I was an embarrassment to the family name. She said I was a completely socially inept failure, who thought crashing a high society vow renewal would somehow force them to acknowledge me. She told me to go back to my empty, pathetic apartment because I would never belong in a room filled with true power and excellence. I did not raise my voice, I did not flinch, and I certainly did not cause a scene. I simply looked at my sister, my brother-in-law, and the two arrogant security guards with cold, unblinking calculation. I reached into my clutch and pulled out my phone. Jasmine rolled her eyes and loudly mocked me, telling her friends that I was probably pulling up the Uber app because I could not even afford a town car home. I ignored her entirely. I opened my contacts, selected a specific encrypted number, and sent a single 3-word text message. The message was sent directly to Arthur Vance, the regional executive director of the hospitality group that managed this exact hotel. I slid the phone back into my clutch, crossed my arms, and stared directly at Connor. I told him that true excellence did not require siphoning 40% of a trust fund into Cayman Island shell accounts. I told him that true power did not involve begging private equity firms to cover massive cryptocurrency losses. Connor froze. The color drained from his face so fast he looked like a ghost. His mouth opened to speak, but no sound came out. The absolute terror of realization was finally setting into his eyes. Before Jasmine could ask what I was talking about, a commotion erupted at the top of the grand marble staircase. The heavy brass doors of the executive office suite slammed open. Arthur Vance, the impeccably dressed general manager of the Elysian Plaza, was sprinting down the carpeted stairs. He was moving with a level of frantic, unbridled panic that immediately silenced the string quartet and caused every wealthy guest in the foyer to turn and stare. Arthur bounded off the last step and rushed directly toward the velvet ropes, completely out of breath. He shoved past a stunned Connor and nearly knocked over the lead security guard. He stopped directly in front of me, his face pale with absolute terror, and bowed his head in deep, unmistakable deference. He apologized profusely, his voice carrying across the silent lobby. He stated that he had absolutely no idea I was arriving tonight and begged for my forgiveness regarding the unacceptable behavior of the contracted security team. He turned to the two massive guards, his eyes blazing with fury, and ordered them to step away from the entrance immediately or they would be terminated on the spot. Jasmine stepped forward, her voice shrill with confusion. She demanded to know what Arthur was doing. She shouted that she had rented this entire floor and that I was an uninvited trespasser who needed to be removed. Arthur Vance turned to my sister with an expression of pure, unfiltered pity. He adjusted his suit jacket and spoke loud enough for every single investor, socialite, and family member in the room to hear. He informed Jasmine that she had merely rented the ballroom for the evening. He then turned back to me, gestured respectfully toward the open doors, and personally escorted me past the velvet ropes. Arthur announced to the dead silent room that he answered directly to me because my holding company owned the entire hospitality group, the building, the ballroom, and the very ground Connor was sweating on. I walked past my completely paralyzed family, stepped into the grand ballroom, and prepared to meet the man who thought he was playing me. The ballroom of the Elysian Plaza was a breathtaking masterclass in financial delusion. Connor had spared absolutely no expense with money that did not belong to him. 10-tier crystal chandeliers cast a brilliant warm glow over 50 circular tables, each draped in imported white silk and adorned with towering centerpieces of rare white orchids. A 12-piece string quartet played a flawless, elegant rendition of Vivaldi in the far corner, providing a sophisticated soundtrack to an event built entirely on embezzlement and massive corporate fraud. Waiters in crisp white tuxedos circulated silently through the crowd, carrying heavy silver platters loaded with beluga caviar truffle tarts and glasses of vintage champagne. I walked through the sprawling sea of the Atlanta elite, my tailored emerald gown cutting a sharp, distinct line through the suffocating crowd of pastel cocktail dresses and dark suits. The air in the room was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and desperate, aggressive networking. Every single person in this ballroom thought they were attending the exclusive social event of the season. They had absolutely no idea they were simply unpaid extras in Connor's last-ditch theatrical effort to avoid a federal prison sentence. I spotted my target immediately. The VIP table was positioned on a raised dais near the back of the room, strategically elevated, so Connor could literally look down on his guests. But right now, my brother-in-law was not looking down on anyone. He was leaning entirely too far across the circular table, a distinct sheen of panicked sweat shining on his forehead under the harsh overhead spotlight. He was gesturing frantically with a white linen napkin, trying with every ounce of his being to pitch his failing wealth management portfolio to the man sitting opposite him. Malik sat back in his plush velvet chair, presenting the absolute perfect picture of bored, untouchable wealth. He wore a custom-tailored midnight blue suit and casually swirled a generous pour of bourbon in a heavy crystal glass. He did not look like a corporate investigator. He looked exactly like the ruthless, deep-pocketed private equity shark that Connor so desperately needed him to be. Connor was talking at a mile a minute, throwing out wildly inflated financial projections and completely fabricated return rates. He pushed a thick, glossy folder across the table, tapping nervously on the cover. He was selling a sinking ghost ship, praying blindly that Malik would write a massive bailout check before demanding to check the rotting cargo hold. I did not slow my pace or hesitate for a fraction of a second. I walked directly up the 3 carpeted steps to the VIP dais. Connor caught sight of my emerald dress out of the corner of his eye, and his entire body violently flinched. The frantic sales pitch instantly died in his throat. His face contorted into a rapid, terrifying mask of sheer panic and aristocratic fury. He shot a terrified, apologetic glance at Malik, then quickly shoved his chair back and stood up to intercept me. He plastered a fake, welcoming smile on his face for the benefit of his guest, while his eyes darted absolute daggers at my face. He stepped firmly into my path, physically blocking my access to the table, and aggressively lowered his voice to a harsh, menacing whisper. He demanded to know how I had managed to manipulate Arthur Vance into letting me through the doors. He ordered me to turn around and walk out the back service exit immediately before he made a scene. He spat that he was in the middle of closing a monumental 9-figure deal with Vanguard Acquisitions, and he was not going to let my pathetic, jealous obsession with his success ruin the most important night of his professional life. He threatened to call the police and have me arrested for criminal trespassing if I dared to take one more step toward his table. I simply looked past Connor's trembling shoulder and made direct, unwavering eye contact with Malik. Malik offered a microscopic, almost imperceptible nod, a silent confirmation that Connor had completely swallowed the bait. Connor had just handed over a physical printed copy of his falsified investment prospectus. The hard evidence of his federal wire fraud was currently sitting right on the table, resting securely under the watchful eye of my lead corporate investigator. Before I could verbally dismantle my panicked brother-in-law, a sharp, manicured hand clamped down onto my bare arm like an industrial vice. Long, acrylic nails dug painfully deep into my skin. It was Vivian. My mother had materialized from the dense crowd, her face frozen in a terrifying, camera-ready smile. To the rest of the ballroom, it looked exactly like a loving mother pulling her daughter in for a warm, affectionate embrace. Up close, the reality was pure, unadulterated venom. Vivian yanked me roughly to the side, aggressively positioning her body to block me from Malik's view. She leaned in close, her suffocatingly expensive perfume washing over me, and hissed through her tightly gritted teeth. She demanded to know why I was deliberately trying to destroy my sister's spectacular night. She stated that I had always been exactly like this, a constant, humiliating burden to the family image. She brought up my college graduation, recounting how I had purposefully refused to wear the designer dress she bought me, choosing instead to wear a simple thrifted suit just to humiliate her in front of her wealthy country club friends. She said I was a bitter, deeply ungrateful child who simply could not stand to see Jasmine shine in the spotlight. Vivian tightened her agonizing grip on my arm. Her eyes were hard, flat, and completely uncompromising. She told me I was making an absolute fool of myself in front of the most important people in the city. She whispered frantically that Arthur Vance must have made a terrible career-ending mistake by letting me inside, but she was going to fix it right now. She stated with absolute certainty that hotel security was going to drag me out through the kitchen service elevator in exactly 2 minutes. She looked me up and down with total unfiltered disgust and hissed that I did not belong in this tax bracket. I looked down at my mother's hand gripping my arm. 10 years ago, that exact grip would have paralyzed me. I would have instantly internalized her shame, lowered my head, apologized for my existence, and quietly retreated through the back doors just to maintain the fragile illusion of family peace. But tonight, I felt absolutely nothing but cold, calculated, and supreme resolve. The frightened girl who constantly craved her mother's conditional validation had died a long time ago, starved out by years of financial manipulation and emotional neglect. I smoothly and forcefully brushed her hand off my arm, pushing her wrist away with enough strength to make her stumble slightly backward in her designer heels. I stepped around her stunned form, entirely closing the distance to the VIP table. I reached out and casually picked up a crystal flute of champagne from a passing waiter's silver tray. I took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the expensive, crisp vintage sit on my tongue for a moment. The entire table was watching me now. Connor looked like his heart was about to stop beating entirely. Vivian was vibrating with helpless rage, her fake smile completely gone. Malik simply sat back in his velvet chair, steepled his fingers, and waited for the show to begin. The guests at the immediately adjacent tables had stopped their networking chatter, sensing the sudden, sharp drop in atmospheric pressure on the dais. I turned my head to face Vivian, ensuring my voice was projected loud enough to carry clearly over the string quartet. I made sure my tone was sharp enough for the surrounding tables of Atlanta's elite to hear every single word I said. I told her that she was completely and fundamentally wrong about my tax bracket. I stated with absolute clarity that I had bought the Elysian Plaza Hotel last Tuesday. I took another slow sip of the champagne, lowering the glass, and locked eyes directly with Connor. I announced that if anyone was getting dragged out of the ballroom by security tonight, it was going to be the people drinking my Dom Perignon on a completely expired, fraudulent tab. The silence that followed my declaration was absolute. The clinking of crystal champagne flutes ceased entirely. 50 of Atlanta's most influential power brokers stared in stunned, breathless fascination at the elevated VIP table. Connor stood completely paralyzed. His eyes darted frantically between my face, the tailored lines of my emerald silk gown, and the utterly impassive expression of the man sitting directly across from him. His brain was violently rejecting the reality I had just presented. Instead of accepting defeat, he chose the only defense mechanism he had ever known. He doubled down. Connor threw his head back and let out a booming theatrical laugh that sounded like glass grinding in a garbage disposal. It was an incredibly loud, forced sound designed to project confidence and immediately dismiss my words as the ravings of a lunatic. He turned his back slightly toward me, physically attempting to block my presence from Malik's view, and leaned his hands flat against the table. He looked directly at Malik, shaking his head with a practiced, sympathetic sigh. He loudly announced to the table that he sincerely apologized for the bizarre interruption. He pointed a trembling finger over his shoulder in my direction and smoothly declared that I was his mentally unstable, estranged sister-in-law. Connor leaned in closer to the investors, his voice dropping into a tone of manufactured pity. He explained that I had always been the tragic burden of the family, a woman completely disconnected from reality, who fabricated elaborate delusions of wealth simply because I could not handle his and Jasmine's overwhelming success. He wove his desperate narrative, flawlessly painting a vivid picture of a jealous, unhinged relative who crashed high society events merely to throw embarrassing tantrums. He told Malik that my family had spent years trying to secure me psychiatric help, but I had stubbornly refused, choosing instead to live in a pathetic fantasy world where I bought luxury hotels and owned corporate empires. He waved his hand dismissively in the air, treating my multi-million-dollar acquisition announcement as nothing more than a sad, predictable punchline from a sick woman. Vivian, who had remained frozen mere steps away, instantly caught onto Connor's lifeline. She vigorously nodded her head, dabbing at her dry eyes with a white linen napkin, seamlessly slipping into the role of the heartbroken mother, forced to endure her daughter's public breakdown. She whispered loudly to a nearby socialite that it was an absolute tragedy what untreated mental illness could do to a respected family's reputation, actively working to secure the crowd's sympathy. Connor smoothly pivoted back to the table, desperate to regain control of the room and secure his financial salvation before the illusion shattered entirely. He tapped his manicured index finger against the thick, glossy investment prospectus he had slid across the table just moments before I arrived. He flashed Malik a brilliant, desperate smile, his teeth literally gritted together with anxiety. He stated that they should not let unfortunate family drama distract them from a mutually beneficial $100 million synergy. He urged Malik to look at page 4 of the portfolio, promising guaranteed double-digit returns and immediate offshore liquidity. He swore that his boutique wealth management firm was on the verge of acquiring highly lucrative municipal contracts that would triple their initial investment within a single fiscal quarter. Connor was practically vibrating with need, begging the private equity shark sitting before him to ignore the crazy woman behind him and sign the bailout check that would keep him out of federal custody. Malik did not look at page 4. He did not return Connor's desperate, hungry smile. He did not offer a polite chuckle at the expense of the allegedly unstable sister-in-law. Malik simply sat in his plush velvet chair, a portrait of chilling, absolute stillness. The contrast between Connor's frantic, sweating energy and Malik's cold, calculated professionalism was staggering. Slowly, methodically, Malik reached out and placed his hand flat on top of Connor's fake prospectus. He did not open the binder. He did not examine the fraudulent ledgers or the wildly fabricated return projections. He simply pushed it back across the table, the heavy cardstock sliding smoothly over the silk tablecloth until it stopped directly in front of Connor's chest. Connor's fake smile faltered. A heavy bead of sweat broke loose from his hairline and tracked slowly down the side of his face, soaking into his stiff white collar. He stammered, his voice dropping an octave as he asked if there was an issue with the preliminary projections. He desperately offered to run the numbers again to restructure the asset allocation or to personally guarantee the initial capital layout with his own private properties. He promised that his firm was uniquely positioned for explosive regional growth, practically begging for just 10 more minutes to explain the back-end logistics of the deal. Malik did not answer him. Instead, Malik pushed his chair back, the wooden legs scraping softly against the polished floor, and stood up. He rose to his full height, smoothing the impeccable lines of his custom midnight blue suit. He reached down and fastened the single center button of his jacket with a sharp, precise movement that echoed with absolute terrifying finality. He completely ignored Connor's outstretched, trembling hand. He ignored Connor's frantic, pleading eyes. Malik turned his body, bypassing my brother-in-law entirely, and directed his full, undivided attention squarely onto me. He offered a slight, deeply respectful bow of his head, acknowledging my absolute authority in a room filled with people who had spent my entire life telling me I was worthless. His voice cut through the silent, breathless ballroom, clear, resonant, and completely devoid of any conversational warmth. He looked directly into my eyes and spoke the exact words that would end Connor's life as he knew it. "Ms. Zora, shall I inform Mr. Connor that Vanguard Acquisitions is declining his pitch due to massive financial fraud?" The words dropped onto the VIP table like a live, unpinned grenade. The transition in Connor's face was catastrophic. The blood drained from his cheeks so rapidly he looked like an animated corpse. His jaw unhinged, falling open in a silent, suffocating gasp as his brain desperately tried to process the impossible, devastating collision of facts. Vanguard Acquisitions, the faceless corporate entity he had spent the last 6 months blindly courting. The massive financial conglomerate he had begged for a lifeline. The primary elite investor he had invited to his million-dollar vanity project in a last-ditch effort to save himself from a federal indictment. He stared at Malik, the ruthless private equity shark he had been sweating over and pitching to all night, realizing the man was nothing more than an employee following orders. Then Connor slowly, painfully turned his head to look directly at me. The puzzle pieces violently snapped together in his mind with bone-crushing force. The woman standing before him in an emerald gown, the woman who had just claimed ownership of the entire hotel property, was not a mentally unstable, estranged relative looking for attention. She was the chief executive officer of Vanguard Acquisitions. She was the apex predator he had unknowingly invited into his own meticulously designed trap. Connor's legs gave out completely. He stumbled backward, his knees hitting the edge of his chair, sending it crashing loudly to the hardwood floor. He stared at me with wide, unblinking horror, realizing with absolute terrifying certainty that the faceless billionaire he had been trying to scam for 6 months was the exact same sister-in-law he had just told to take an Uber from the airport. The heavy thud of Connor's chair hitting the floor was the only sound that broke the tension on the raised dais. He scrambled backward, his polished leather shoes slipping on the hardwood, staring at me as if the floor had just opened up to reveal the gates of hell. He could not speak. The sheer magnitude of his miscalculation had effectively short-circuited his brain. He had invited his own executioner to his vanity party and handed over the murder weapon. I did not give him a moment to recover. I raised my right hand and made a single sharp slashing motion through the air toward the string quartet in the far corner of the ballroom. The lead violinist caught my gesture and abruptly lowered his bow. The cellist followed a second later. The elegant Vivaldi concerto died a sudden, jarring death, replaced by the suffocating quiet of a room suddenly stripped of its ambiance. The abrupt silence rippled outward from the musicians like a shockwave. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Laughter evaporated. The clinking of crystal glasses ceased entirely. 50 circular tables filled with Atlanta's most influential power brokers turned their collective attention toward the VIP table. They could smell the blood in the water. Desmond pushed his way to the front of the dais, his face a mottled, furious red. My father was a man who had spent his entire life coasting on the perceived prestige of his surname, demanding absolute respect while offering absolutely nothing in return. He puffed out his chest, stepping squarely between me and Malik, completely misinterpreting the dynamic of the room. He assumed I was causing a scene. He assumed I was the problem that needed to be managed. He pointed a thick, manicured finger at my face and ordered me to stop this ridiculous stunt immediately. He demanded to know how I had gained access to a private event and loudly threatened to have Arthur Vance fired for his sheer incompetence. He turned to Malik, flashing a placating, deeply arrogant smile, and apologized for his daughter's deeply unfortunate mental state. He told Malik that Vanguard Acquisitions should not let the ravings of a bitter, jealous woman interfere with a highly profitable business arrangement. Malik did not even blink. He simply looked at Desmond with the clinical detachment of a man observing an insect. I reached out and took the sleek black leather folder Malik had been holding flat against his thigh. I turned back to the table, raised the heavy folder, and slammed it down directly on top of Connor's fraudulent investment prospectus. The sharp, violent smack echoed across the silent ballroom like a gunshot. Vivian jumped, her hand flying to her pearl necklace. Jasmine let out a short, terrified gasp. I looked directly into my father's arrogant eyes and told him to stop apologizing for me. I stated clearly and loudly that the only person in this room who needed to apologize was the man who had just bankrupted the entire family. Desmond frowned, his thick eyebrows pulling together in deep confusion. He crossed his arms and demanded to know what on earth I was talking about. He proudly declared that the family finances were stronger than they had been in a decade, boasting that the Legacy Trust Fund had been yielding unprecedented monthly dividends thanks to Connor's brilliant wealth management strategies. He puffed his chest out further, loudly proclaiming that the family was absolutely untouchable. I let out a harsh, freezing laugh. I reached into the black folder and pulled out a thick stack of certified bank records, wire transfer logs, and corporate ownership documents. I dropped the first stack of papers directly in front of Desmond's face. I told him to look very closely at the routing numbers. I watched his eyes scan the top document, waiting for the exact moment the delusion shattered. I informed him that the mythical Family Legacy Trust Fund did not exist. I explained that grandfather's original investments had dried up over 4 years ago because Desmond had spent his entire adult life bleeding the principal dry to fund his country club memberships and imported cars. Vivian lunged forward, her voice shrill and panicked. She yelled that I was lying. She screamed that she had seen the monthly statements herself, that Connor delivered the dividend checks every single month like clockwork. I did not break eye contact with Desmond. I told my mother she was absolutely right about the checks arriving every month. But I brutally clarified exactly where those checks were coming from. I announced to the entire table and to the hundreds of silent guests watching our every move that I was the sole benefactor of that trust. I told them that I had used a subsidiary of Vanguard Acquisitions to quietly funnel millions of dollars into their accounts to keep them from drowning in their own financial incompetence. I paid for the designer suits. I paid for the mortgage. I paid for the very champagne they were currently drinking. Desmond's face went completely slack. The arrogant patriarch facade crumbled into dust. He stared at the corporate seals on the documents, his mind struggling to comprehend that the daughter he had treated like a worthless scapegoat had been secretly financing his entire existence. But I was not finished. I pulled the second stack of documents from the folder and dropped them on top of the first. I told Desmond that he should have paid closer attention to the man managing his charity. I explained that while I had authorized specific monthly payouts to keep a roof over their heads, Connor and Uncle Roland had quietly established a network of Cayman Island shell corporations. I detailed exactly how my brother-in-law had been systematically siphoning off 40% of the incoming capital, laundering it offshore, and using it to fund his own failing boutique firm. I told Desmond he had been robbed blind by the golden boy he loved so much. Jasmine let out a piercing, hysterical cry. She grabbed Connor's arm violently, shaking him, demanding that he tell everyone I was making this up. She screamed at him to pull out his own records and prove that I was nothing but a jealous, vindictive liar. Connor did not speak. He could not even look at his wife. He kept his eyes fixed firmly on the floor, his entire body trembling as the absolute reality of federal wire fraud and decades in prison washed over him. Desmond's hands began to shake. He reached out and touched the bank records, his breathing turning shallow and erratic. He tried to muster a shred of his former authority, loudly declaring that even if Connor had made some unfortunate accounting errors, the family still had their assets. He stammered that they still owned the Buckhead estate, the properties, and the physical wealth that made them elite. I reached into the folder one last time. I pulled out a single heavy sheet of premium parchment paper bearing the official embossed seal of a major national bank. I did not drop this document. I held it between my fingers and slowly slid it across the table until it rested directly under Desmond's hands. I told him he owned absolutely nothing. Desmond looked down at the paper. It was a formal expedited notice of foreclosure. The document clearly stated that the sprawling multi-million-dollar Buckhead mansion was being seized by the bank effective immediately. Vivian let out a choked, suffocated sob. She grabbed the edge of the table, her knuckles turning white, and desperately asked how this was possible. She insisted the house had been paid off for years. I looked at my mother with absolute unyielding ice in my veins. I explained that Connor had suffered catastrophic losses in the cryptocurrency market 6 months ago. Desperate for liquidity to cover his tracks and keep his wealthy investors from demanding audits, he had quietly leveraged everything he had access to. I told Vivian that Connor had used the financial power of attorney they had so willingly handed over to him. He had taken out massive high-interest loans against the full appraised value of their estate. He had bet their entire home on volatile digital assets, and he had lost every single penny. I told them the loans had been in default for 90 days. The bank was not negotiating. The property was gone. They were officially homeless. Desmond's world completely imploded. The color drained from his face, leaving him a sickly, terrifying shade of gray. The illusion of his power, his wealth, and his legacy had been brutally and surgically eradicated in less than 3 minutes. He slowly lifted his head, his face contorting into a mask of pure, murderous rage. He turned his head toward the edge of the dais, fully prepared to demand a furious explanation from the man who had destroyed his life. Desmond opened his mouth to scream Connor's name, but Connor was not standing beside his wife. Connor was not preparing a defense or begging for forgiveness. Connor was literally backing away from the VIP table, his hands raised in a gesture of pure surrender, his terrified eyes locked onto the glowing red exit sign above the kitchen service doors. Connor was actively retreating, his polished leather shoes sliding frantically against the hardwood as he backed away from the table. The sheer force of his cowardice finally snapped Jasmine out of her paralyzed shock. She lunged forward, her enormous, custom-designed white gown rustling violently, and grabbed her husband by the arm to halt his retreat. She spun around to face me, her features contorted into a mask of pure, ugly hysteria. She screamed at the top of her lungs, her voice cracking under the strain, demanding that I stop this ridiculous, jealous performance immediately. She shrieked that I was intentionally ruining her vow renewal, the most important and expensive night of her entire life. She pointed a shaking finger at my face and yelled that I was a bitter, pathetic spinster who wanted nothing more than to drag everyone else down into my miserable, lonely existence. She demanded that security remove me before I embarrassed the family any further in front of their elite guests. I turned my gaze slowly from the retreating coward to my sister. I did not raise my voice to match her frantic, shrill pitch. Instead, I reached back into the heavy black leather folder that rested on the VIP table. I pulled out a fresh stack of documents secured with a thick silver binder clip. These were not foreclosure notices. These were heavily detailed certified international banking ledgers, printed on thick legal paper that carried the undeniable weight of absolute truth. I walked directly up to Jasmine. I grabbed her wrist, completely ignoring her sharp gasp of outrage, and slapped the thick stack of financial records directly into her open palm. I instructed her to look at the offshore account routing numbers highlighted on the very first page. I told her to read the corporate ownership registries attached to the back of the packet. Jasmine blinked rapidly, her camera-ready makeup beginning to smudge with angry, confused tears as she looked down at the papers. I did not give her time to process the complex financial jargon. I translated it for her, projecting my voice so that the 50 tables of Atlanta's most prominent socialites and investors could hear every single damning syllable. I explained that her perfect husband and our beloved, highly respected Uncle Roland had been running a highly coordinated, incredibly lucrative embezzlement ring for the last 3 years. I told her that every single month, when I silently transferred millions of dollars from Vanguard acquisitions to keep our parents from drowning in bankruptcy, Connor and Roland intercepted the capital. They skimmed 40% right off the top, forged the accounting records, and funneled the stolen money directly into a complex network of Cayman Island shell corporations that they controlled jointly. I pointed directly at the massive glittering diamond necklace resting heavily against her collarbone. I told her that her imported jewelry, her extravagant designer gown, the vintage champagne flowing freely through the room, and this entire pathetic million-dollar vanity project were completely funded by stolen money. Connor had not earned a single dime of his perceived wealth. He had stolen it directly from his own in-laws and laundered it through his failing boutique management firm to maintain the illusion of success. I watched the blood rapidly drain from Jasmine's face as the reality of her husband's absolute fraud crashed down upon her shoulders. The high society illusion she had spent years carefully cultivating shattered into a million irreparable pieces right in front of her wealthiest, most judgmental friends. Her knees buckled slightly, and she collapsed into a velvet dining chair, dropping the banking ledgers onto the floor as she let out a loud, uncontrollable sob. While my sister wept over her ruined social standing, my eyes scanned the perimeter of the elevated dais. Desmond was still staring blankly at his foreclosure notice, his chest heaving with rapid, shallow breaths. Vivian was gripping the edge of the table, looking like she was moments away from fainting. Connor was practically pressing himself into the far wall, desperately looking for a place to hide. But Uncle Roland was actually making a move. The loud, boastful patriarch who had stood in my hallway just hours earlier, demanding my respect and threatening my physical safety, had completely dropped his aggressive, righteous facade. He was abandoning his brother, abandoning his niece, and abandoning his partner in crime without a second thought. He was moving with surprising speed for a man of his considerable size, keeping his head down and slinking quietly along the darkened edge of the ballroom. He was heading straight for the massive brass double doors leading out to the main hotel foyer. He actually thought he could slip away in the chaos. He thought he could escape the blast radius of his own devastating crimes. I raised my right hand high above my head and snapped my fingers. The sharp sound echoed like a gunshot through the cavernous, deadly silent room. I locked eyes with the head of hotel security, the exact same thick-necked man who had previously threatened to drag me out into the street. Now operating under the direct, terrified orders of Arthur Vance, the guard was entirely at my absolute command. I pointed directly at the main ballroom doors. The security guard did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. He and 3 other large men in dark, tailored suits stepped seamlessly in front of the brass handles. They pulled the heavy doors shut with a resounding, echoing boom and turned the massive deadbolts. The heavy mechanical clicks sounded exactly like a prison cell locking firmly into place. Uncle Roland stopped dead in his tracks. He was less than 10 feet away from freedom. He slowly turned around to face the room, his signature unlit cigar slipping from his trembling fingers and tumbling onto the pristine carpet. The color had completely vanished from his usually flushed, arrogant face, leaving him looking old, frail, and completely terrified. I walked down the steps of the VIP dais, my heels clicking rhythmically against the polished floor, and stopped in the absolute center of the ballroom. The entire crowd parted for me instinctively, creating a wide, unobstructed path between me and my corrupt uncle. I looked directly at Roland, projecting my voice, so every single power broker, investor, and socialite in the room could witness the total destruction of Atlanta's most notorious fraud. I asked Roland if he was leaving the party early. I feigned polite, exaggerated surprise, noting that the celebration was just getting to the very best part. I told him he should stay and celebrate his incredible, unprecedented financial achievements with his family. Roland opened his mouth, stammering and sputtering uncontrollably. He tried desperately to summon his booming, authoritative voice, attempting to command the security guards to open the doors immediately. He threatened to call his high-priced lawyers. He yelled that he was a respected, untouchable pillar of the community, and that holding him in this room against his will was a severe criminal offense. His threats were empty, hollow, and completely devoid of any real power. He was nothing more than a trapped rat, panicking inside a gilded cage. I did not smile. I did not flinch. I reached into my clutch and pulled out my phone, holding it up high for him to clearly see. I told Roland that his expensive lawyers were going to be incredibly busy for the foreseeable future. I explained that I had not just been tracking his offshore shell corporations with Connor. My elite forensic accounting team had spent the last week executing a deep, microscopic dive into the community outreach nonprofit he loved to brag about at every single country club dinner. I told him we had easily uncovered the phantom payrolls, the fake vendor invoices, and the entirely non-existent charity grants he had been utilizing to quietly wash his stolen cash for years. The silence in the room was so profound, so heavy, that I could clearly hear the erratic, panicked breathing of the wealthy guests sitting at the nearest tables. People who had donated thousands of dollars to Roland's charities were staring at him with open, unmasked disgust. I lowered my phone and delivered the final crushing blow. I announced to the dead silent room that he did not need to worry about calling the authorities tonight because I had already done it for him. I stated clearly and coldly that my legal team had forwarded every single page of his fraudulent nonprofit ledgers, offshore bank transfers, and meticulous embezzlement records directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation at exactly 8 o'clock this morning. Uncle Roland let out a strangled, pathetic wheeze that sounded like a deflating tire. His knees buckled under his massive tailored frame, and he collapsed heavily onto the carpeted floor of the ballroom. His back slid down the locked brass double doors, leaving a smudge of sweat on the polished metal. The man who had spent the last decade positioning himself as Atlanta's premier philanthropist, the untouchable titan of high society charity, was instantly reduced to a hyperventilating heap. He sat on the floor and wept openly, his broad shoulders shaking as the terrifying reality of federal prison erased every last ounce of his arrogant bravado. The reaction from the ballroom was instantaneous and visceral. The suffocating silence finally broke, replaced by a rising chaotic crescendo of furious, scandalized whispers. 50 tables of elite investors, politicians, and socialites collectively recoiled in horror. I watched as several prominent board members of Roland's various charities immediately stood up from their tables, their faces pale with rage and intense legal panic. They grabbed their spouses and began marching rapidly toward the secondary exits, desperate to distance themselves from a man who was about to be indicted by the federal government. The people my family had spent their entire lives bowing down to the elite circle they had sacrificed my sanity to impress were now physically distancing themselves from the VIP dais as if the very air around my relatives was highly toxic. Desmond watched his peers literally turn their backs on him. The absolute destruction of his carefully curated social empire was happening in real-time broadcast to the exact audience he worshipped above all else. The psychological impact hit him with the force of a physical blow. He staggered backward, his legs giving out as he hit the edge of the velvet dining table. His hand flew up to his chest, gripping the lapel of his expensive tuxedo. He clawed at the fine fabric, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish, gasping for oxygen that his lungs simply refused to process. There was no medical emergency. His heart was perfectly fine. What Desmond was experiencing was the agonizing, suffocating death of his immense ego. The legendary family patriarch, the man who had demanded absolute subservience from his children and unquestioned respect from his city, had been exposed as a penniless, incompetent fraud. He had been living entirely off the secret charity of the daughter he openly despised. He looked out at the sea of disgusted faces, searching desperately for a single sympathetic eye among his wealthy country club friends. He found absolutely nothing but intense judgment, condescending pity, and unfiltered scorn. His legs gave way completely, and he slumped heavily into his chair, clutching his chest as he stared vacantly at the bank's foreclosure notice resting on the silk tablecloth. The sight of her husband collapsing into a panic attack and her brother-in-law weeping on the floor like a trapped animal finally shattered Vivian's polished high society facade. The manufactured theatrical tears she had been dabbing at earlier vanished, replaced instantly by genuine raw terror. The crushing realization that she was officially homeless, completely penniless, and a permanent social pariah hit her brain like a runaway freight train. Vivian scrambled down the steps of the VIP dais, her expensive designer heels catching on the intricate hem of her gown. She nearly tripped, but caught herself rushing frantically across the polished floor until she was standing just inches away from me. She threw her hands out, attempting to grab my arms in a desperate embrace, but Malik smoothly stepped forward. His massive frame blocked her advance with effortless, terrifying intimidation. Vivian shrank back, but her sheer desperation completely overrode whatever dignity she had left. She clasped her hands tightly together in front of her chest, her face streaked with ruined mascara, and let out a loud theatrical sob that echoed over the murmuring crowd. She looked up at me, her eyes wide and pleading, and seamlessly shifted into a role so hypocritical it actually made my stomach turn. She loudly wailed that I was her brilliant, beautiful daughter. She cried out to the watching room that she had always known I was destined for absolute greatness, aggressively claiming that my immense corporate success was a direct testament to the strong family values she had personally instilled in me. Vivian begged me to understand that they had absolutely no idea Connor and Roland were stealing my money. She swore on her life that she and Desmond were innocent, trusting victims of Connor's vicious manipulation. She sobbed that the family needed to stick together during this terrible betrayal, practically screaming that I had the power to fix all of this with a single phone call to my legal team. She pleaded with me to pay off the massive estate loans out of my own pocket, promising that if I just saved their home and restored their reputation, everything would be different. She swore to God that they would finally give me the respect, the validation, and the love I had always deserved. I stood perfectly still, letting her desperate, humiliating pleas wash over me without absorbing a single drop of her panic. I looked at the woman who had spent 30 years criticizing my appearance, mocking my ambition, and treating my very existence like an unfortunate stain on her perfect family portrait. I looked past her to Jasmine, who was still slumped in her chair, weeping uncontrollably over her ruined vow renewal and her impending bankruptcy. I looked at Connor, the pathetic coward pressing himself silently into the back wall. I looked at Desmond, entirely paralyzed by his own shattered ego. I felt absolutely nothing, no anger, no sorrow, no sympathy, just a profound, chilling clarity. I stepped around Malik, closing the final distance between me and my mother. I kept my voice low, but the flawless acoustics of the grand ballroom carried my words clearly to the disgraced family cowering on the dais and to the hundreds of silent guests leaning in to hear my verdict. I reminded them of the text message they had sent me just hours before I arrived in Atlanta. I reminded them of the exact phrasing they had used when they thought I was a struggling, worthless relative asking for a simple ride from the airport. "You texted that you wanted distance," I said, my voice echoing in the dead silent room with surgical precision. "You made it abundantly clear that my presence was a massive inconvenience, a burden you simply did not want to manage. You demanded absolute separation so you could enjoy your fraudulent wealth in peace." Vivian shook her head violently, her hands reaching out toward me again in a pathetic, begging gesture. She swore that the text message was just a terrible misunderstanding, a joke taken out of context. I ignored her entirely, raising my voice, so it commanded the attention of every single person remaining in the ballroom. "You have it!" I announced, the finality of my words dropping over the room like a heavy iron vault. "You have your distance. You are now entirely separated from my bank accounts, my properties, and my protection. Every single cent of my capital has been withdrawn from your lives. You are completely on your own, and whatever the federal authorities and the banks do to you next is absolutely none of my concern." Vivian let out a sharp, agonizing wail, dropping to her knees right there on the ballroom floor. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing loudly as the absolute reality of her new, impoverished life finally settled in. Jasmine shrieked her mother's name from the dais, but neither Connor nor Desmond moved a single muscle to help her. They were all completely isolated in their own personal hells, permanently trapped in a cage of their own making. I did not offer a single backward glance. I turned on my heel, the heavy emerald silk of my gown sweeping gracefully across the floor. Malik immediately fell into step beside me, a silent, imposing guardian matching my confident stride. The sea of wealthy guests parted instinctively, giving me a wide, highly respectful berth as I walked toward the grand exit. The air was thick with the frantic, excited whispers of Atlanta's elite. They were already dissecting the greatest downfall in the history of the city's social scene, tearing my family's ruined reputation to absolute shreds before I had even left the room. The exact people my parents had sacrificed everything to impress were now actively plotting how to divide their seized assets and take over their vacant social positions. I walked straight through the massive brass doors held open by my personal hotel security team. I stepped out into the cool, quiet elegance of the grand foyer, leaving the chaos, the fraud, and the pathetic remnants of my former family entirely behind me. I walked out of my hotel breathing in the crisp night air, completely and beautifully free. The aftermath of the Vanguard Acquisitions Gala was swift, brutal, and entirely public. The federal authorities did not waste a single minute. Within 72 hours of my legal team handing over the forensic accounting files, the FBI executed a highly coordinated raid on Connor's boutique wealth management firm. The local Atlanta news stations interrupted their regular afternoon broadcasting to show raw helicopter footage of federal agents swarming the building. They carried out dozens of sealed cardboard boxes, filing cabinets, and encrypted hard drives from his sleek, glass-fronted office. Connor was escorted out through the main lobby in heavy steel handcuffs. His expensive custom-tailored suit looked absurdly out of place against the harsh, unforgiving reality of a federal wire fraud indictment. He was facing decades in federal prison, and the terrified, sunken look on his face as the cameras flashed proved he finally understood the inescapable gravity of his crimes. Uncle Roland did not fare any better. The beloved, untouchable philanthropist of Atlanta high society was unceremoniously stripped of his titles and his dignity. The IRS moved with surgical precision, freezing every single one of his domestic and international assets. The charities he had used as personal piggy banks for money laundering were immediately dissolved by state regulators. Roland was slapped with a staggering multi-page list of federal charges ranging from grand embezzlement to corporate tax evasion. His sprawling estate was padlocked by government officials. His wealthy country club peers the exact same people who had once toasted his generosity and attended his lavish fundraisers instantly treated his name like a fatal contagion. Jasmine's manufactured picture-perfect reality collapsed with equal spectacular force. Without Connor's offshore slush funds to finance her endless vanity, the creditors swarmed her estate like vultures. I read the detailed clinical reports from my private security team outlining how two heavy-duty flatbed tow trucks arrived at her upscale gated neighborhood in the middle of a sunny Tuesday afternoon. The repo men did not care about her social standing, her pristine manicured lawn, or her frantic, tearful demands to speak to their manager. They hooked up her custom white G-Wagon and Connor's imported Porsche, dragging the luxury vehicles down the quiet suburban street, while half a dozen of her elite neighbors watched and recorded the entire scene from their manicured driveways. Jasmine was left standing barefoot on the pavement, clutching her designer phone, realizing that her entire identity had been repossessed along with the vehicles. My parents experienced the most profound and poetic justice of all. The bank did not grant them a grace period or a temporary extension on the Buckhead estate. The foreclosure proceeded exactly as the legal paperwork dictated. Desmond and Vivian were forced to pack whatever basic personal belongings the bank had not laid claim to and vacate the sprawling multi-million-dollar mansion they had used as a weapon of superiority for their entire adult lives. They relocated to a cramped two-bedroom apartment with peeling linoleum floors on the industrial outskirts of the city. There were no more charity galas. There were no more vintage champagne toasts on wraparound verandas. When Vivian tried to call her elite country club friends for sympathy, a favor, or a quick bridge loan, her calls went straight to voicemail. Desmond attempted to secure a high-level consulting job using his legacy surname, only to be politely but firmly shown the door by corporate executives who had read the front-page articles about his son-in-law's massive, humiliating fraud ring. The high society peers they had sacrificed my mental health to impress had completely iced them out. They were absolute pariahs, isolated in a tiny, echoing apartment, surrounded by nothing but the suffocating consequences of their own toxic arrogance. It took exactly 4 months for the silence to break. As the mounting legal fees threatened to drown them and the harsh reality of their impoverished life truly set in, my parents finally realized that the daughter they had repeatedly dismissed as a bitter, jealous spinster was the only remaining source of capital in their bloodline. They did not reach out with genuine remorse. They reached out of pure, unadulterated desperation. I received an urgent alert from the concierge desk at the Vanguard Acquisitions corporate headquarters. Desmond and Vivian had somehow bypassed the outer electronic security gate and were physically standing in the main marble lobby, aggressively demanding an immediate audience with the chief executive officer. I sat back in my plush leather chair behind the massive desk in my penthouse suite, tapping a silver pen against my blotter as I watched the live high-definition security feed on my monitor. My parents looked incredibly small, entirely stripped of their former grandeur and artificial confidence. Vivian was wearing an outdated, wrinkled trench coat, nervously clutching her worn purse to her chest. Desmond's posture was heavily hunched. The authoritative, booming patriarch had been replaced by a desperate, aging man trying to intimidate a seasoned corporate security team. He was arguing with the head guard, waving a thick, sealed white envelope in the air, loudly insisting that he had an urgent private family emergency to discuss directly with me. I could see the sheer panic in his eyes, the frantic, terrifying realization that his name no longer commanded doors to open. The thick envelope was undoubtedly a lengthy, groveling apology letter. I knew exactly what it contained without having to read a single handwritten word. It would be filled to the brim with manufactured tears, empty promises, and pathetic, sprawling excuses blaming Connor and Roland for their own financial blindness. They would swear they had fundamentally changed. They would beg for a second chance, pleading for family unity, while subtly laying the groundwork to ask for a massive financial bailout to pay their mounting legal bills and secure a better living situation. They were desperately banking on the traditional family dynamic to kick in. They were praying that deep down I was still the discarded, eager-to-please daughter, desperate for their validation, and willing to write a blank check to finally buy their love. I picked up the dedicated security phone on my desk. I did not feel a single flicker of hesitation, guilt, or familial obligation. I pressed the button to connect directly to the lobby desk. I instructed the head of security that I had absolutely no space on my calendar for uninvited guests. I ordered him to turn them away immediately and to explicitly inform them that any future attempts to enter the premises would be treated as criminal trespassing. As I watched the monitor, the guard relayed my exact, uncompromising message. The devastation that washed over my parents' faces was absolute and irreversible. Vivian slumped heavily against Desmond, her hands flying to her mouth in shock, while my father stared up at the security camera, finally understanding that the bridge was burned to ash. The guard reached out and took the thick sealed apology letter from Desmond's shaking hand. Following my final explicit instruction, the guard pulled out a thick red marker, wrote "Return to sender" across the front of the envelope and handed it right back to my father. I cut the video feed, plunging the screen to black, and permanently severed them from my life. The cool, crisp night wind whipped across the sweeping wraparound terrace of my Buckhead penthouse, carrying with it the electric thrumming energy of the city far below. From this elevation, the Atlanta skyline looked less like a battleground and more like a conquest. The glittering skyscrapers stood like monuments to power, and for the first time in my life, I looked at them not as an outsider banging on locked doors, but as the architect who owned the master keys. Malik stood beside me at the edge of the glass barricade, the city lights reflecting off the flawless lapels of his charcoal suit. He unrolled a massive, heavy sheet of architectural blueprints, spreading them flat against the polished marble surface of the outdoor viewing table. He placed a solid brass paperweight on one corner to fight the wind, his long, dark fingers tracing the intricate white lines of the schematics. There was no longer any need for the cold, terrifying intimidation he had utilized to dismantle my family. Tonight his posture was relaxed, exuding the quiet, absolute confidence of a man who had successfully helped execute a flawless corporate war. He pointed to the center of the blueprint, detailing the structural foundation of a sprawling, multi-building campus. He informed me that the City Zoning Commission had officially approved the permits that morning. The demolition of the old, blighted industrial sector would begin next Tuesday, clearing the exact path for the Vanguard Initiative headquarters. I looked down at the sprawling design. This was not a vanity project. This was not a hollow, fraudulent charity designed to funnel stolen money into Cayman Island bank accounts, while wealthy socialites clapped in air-conditioned ballrooms. This was a tangible, aggressive structural intervention. I traced the outline of the Primary Innovation Center. I told Malik that the scholarship endowment needed to be doubled before we broke ground. I instructed him to completely bypass the traditional academic gatekeepers. We were not looking for women with perfect, pristine resumes or acceptable, quiet demeanors. I wanted my team to scour the city for the brilliant, loud, fiercely independent Black women who had been completely overlooked. I wanted the dropouts. I wanted the women who had been told they were too much, too ambitious, and too difficult to manage. I wanted the women who had been shoved into the background by people terrified of their potential. I told Malik we were going to hand those exact women the capital, the resources, and the corporate backing to build their own empires. We were going to fund the next generation of apex predators. Malik looked up from the blueprints, meeting my eyes with a look of profound, unwavering respect. He offered a sharp, definitive nod. He stated that the legal trusts were already established and completely impenetrable. He assured me that this foundation would outlast every single corrupt institution in this city. He rolled the heavy blueprints back into a tight cylinder, stepping back to let me take in the view. The sound of genuine, vibrant laughter drifted out through the open floor-to-ceiling glass doors behind me. It was not the forced, grating, high-pitched cackling of Jasmine's country club friends. It was the rich, deep sound of absolute joy. I turned away from the skyline and looked into the massive, brilliantly lit living room of my penthouse. The space was filled with the only people who actually mattered. Arthur Vance, the brilliant, ruthless hotel manager my father had arrogantly threatened to fire, was standing by the marble kitchen island, pouring generous measures of vintage bourbon for my lead forensic accountants. The legal team that had systematically dismantled Connor's fraudulent empire in federal court was gathered around the fireplace, recounting the exact terrifying moment my brother-in-law realized he was going to prison. My true friends, the women who had shared cramped studio apartments with me, the women who had forced me to eat when I was working 100-hour weeks, the women who had never once asked me to shrink myself to make them feel comfortable, were dominating the velvet sofas. They were radiant, powerful, and completely unapologetic. This was my chosen family. They were not bound to me by the toxic, suffocating chains of biological obligation. They were bound by mutual respect, shared battles, and absolute, undeniable loyalty. They had earned their place in this room, just as I had earned the right to stand at the head of it. Arthur caught my eye from across the room. He smiled, lifting a crystal champagne flute from a silver tray, and walked out onto the terrace. He handed me the glass with a slight, respectful bow of his head. He did not say a word, but the profound gratitude and loyalty in his expression spoke volumes. He turned and walked back inside to join the celebration, leaving me alone with the night sky. I stepped up to the very edge of the glass balcony, the cold crystal of the flute cool against my palm. I looked down at the sprawling, glittering grid of Atlanta traffic, the red and white lights pulsing like blood through the veins of the city. Somewhere down there in a cramped, echoing apartment, Desmond and Vivian were sitting in stunned, suffocating silence, surrounded by unopened, returned letters. Somewhere down there, Connor was sitting in a federal holding cell, waiting for a trial he could never win. Somewhere down there, Jasmine was staring at a repossessed driveway, completely stripped of the only identity she had ever known. They had spent my entire life branding me with their vicious, unforgiving labels. They had called me the tragic burden. They had called me a bitter, jealous spinster. They had looked down their noses and proudly declared me the socially unfit dropout who would never amount to anything. I raised my glass to the skyline, the champagne catching the reflection of the city lights. They were absolutely right about one thing. I never fit into their world. I was never meant to survive in their shallow, fraudulent, pathetic little ecosystem. I was meant to shatter it completely and build something magnificent over the ruins. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the champagne, letting the crisp, freezing perfection wash over me. I was the socially unfit dropout, and today I owned my truth, I owned my absolute peace, and I owned the entire damn empire. True security and self-worth can never be derived from the conditional approval of toxic family members who only value what you can provide for them. The protagonist's journey illustrates that breaking free from emotional manipulation requires immense courage and absolute independence. When people constantly diminish your achievements and treat your boundaries with profound disrespect, the healthiest response is not to shrink yourself to fit their narrative, but to stand firmly in your truth. Sometimes the most profound act of self-love is simply walking away and allowing those who harmed you to face the undeniable consequences of their own destructive actions. Have you ever had to walk away from toxic relationships to protect your own peace? Share your story in the comments below, and do not forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more empowering journeys of resilience and self-discovery.